Okay, welcome everyone today. Thank you for joining us for this webinar titled LGBTQI+ Inclusion in Sport. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the Darebin Council website and YouTube page following the last webinar. Today we have Chrstine Granger and Riley Edwards joining us, and I'd like to start first with an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, in which I work, live and have played for over 7 years. I pay my respects to elders past and present and the Aboriginal elders from other communities who may be here today. If you'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're on today, please feel free to write in the chat bar. My name is Lauren and my role at Council is the Participation and Inclusion Officer, and I'm excited to be facilitating this webinar today. A huge thanks to Vic Health for their support and for making the This Girl Can campaign available for Victorian women. We've had a few goes at trying to get This Girl Can happening this year, and we've finally snuck it in the end of November. First of all, we'll start off with a little bit of housekeeping. As a member of the audience, you are set up on mute with your video off, so kick back and relax and enjoy the session. We encourage you to use the chat function if you have any tech issues. You can message directly our tech support through Moreland Community Connection. We also have the Q&A section for questions that you might have for the presenters after their talk. If you see a question someone else has written, you can thumbs it up. You're welcome to use the chat function for any comments or observations you might have throughout the presentation. But if it's questions, try to use the Q&A. You should be able to access these by looking at the bottom of your screen or on your mobile device as well. Today's structure is we'll have Chrstine speak first and then Riley. So let's kick things off. First, I'd like to introduce Chrstine. Chrstine is the CEO of Proud to Play. She has a wealth of experience and knowledge of working in the sporting, not-for-profit and government sectors across different continents. With a passion for sports development, Chrstine has spent most of her career working with marginalised communities. She spent time with bushmen and street vendors for the big issue, Namibia, is that how you pronounce it?
Namibia.
Namibia, thank you.
Yeah.
At-risk youth while coordinating the street games in Liverpool, England, and has worked across the inclusion sector in Australia with the Centre of Multicultural Youth and more recently in local government as an inclusion and participation officer. Welcome and take it away, Chrstine.
Hey, thanks Lauren for the intro. Thank you everyone for joining us. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all meet and live, which for me is the Wurundjeri people, Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to anyone who may be with us today. I also would like to acknowledge that it is Trans Awareness Week, as Riley kindly pointed out, but if you've just joined us, just a heads up on that one. As Lauren mentioned, Proud to Play is a charity that works across the sport and recreation industry to increase opportunities for LGBTIQ+ people to participate in sport and recreation. We were set up in about 2016 with a sort of sport for development premise, and sort of through the work we've done, we realised there was a large gap in education and knowledge within the sector. So a lot of our work over the past few years has been around capacity building within clubs, state bodies and NSOs. Recently we've gone through a bit of a strategic change, and we're going to be continuing with that piece of work, expand into leisure facilities and hopefully local governments as well. But also what we've recognised is there is a bit of a gap in bridging the connection between the communities and then the sport and recreation sector. So we sort of went, well, there's no point in us doing all this work in the sector if we then don't actually tell the community what's happening, and also work with them around some of the reasons as to why the communities don't necessarily engage in sport and recreation, and specifically traditional mainstream sports, as we would call them. And I think Riley might touch on that a little bit when they talk as well. So just to give you a basic sort of overview of the reasons why we do this work, the research shows that sort of 50% of trans people avoid playing sports that they would like to play. 70% of LGBT plus people do not feel sport is safe and welcoming. 80% of Australians have experienced or witnessed homophobia on the sporting field, and 50% are not out as sexuality or gender diverse to their sporting peers. That is all sport specific, it's not rec specific, and a lot of that comes from, again, what we would class as the more mainstream sports, but data from various research studies. What's interesting about that is that data seems to be very consistent with what we see across the world in this space, in sort of in Western cultures in particular. So that's quite interesting, just to take that it's not specific to Australia. These are common issues that are seen across the world. What we find when we're working with the sport and recreation sector is that a lot of people, through the stats, are scared of joining sport and recreation clubs. And when we work with sport and recreation clubs, there's a lack of education and understanding, but also a sense of fear within clubs about making mistakes. So that's one of the things we try and address in the work that we do. Whenever we're starting in this space, there's a lot of people out there who will say, you know, pick an area of diversion and diversity and inclusion and work on that. You know, what's in your community and what fits your community, and 100% you need to reflect the community that you're in, but at the same time, you don't necessarily know who's in your community, because if someone has a sense of fear or has experienced discrimination, they may not be open to you about who they are. And the other side of that is, whilst you may have a community that has a large percentage of LGBTIQ plus people or people who are culturally diverse, there will be intersections within those communities as well. So as a member of any community, I should be able to come along to any sporting club or recreation facility and feel like I'm welcome in that space. That doesn't mean that you have to have a program for everybody, but what we do say is it's really good to look at come into your space and look at it as if it's not you, or speak to people in different communities and ask them how they see your space. So to give an example, if I'm walking into your facility as a gay woman and I don't see anything that says, hey, we're inclusive and welcoming of the LGBTQI plus communities, that's for me going to go, okay, well, they might not accept me for who I am, so I'm already on the defensive. Whereas if you have a little rainbow flag, and it seems really simple, but just something like that that's visible to me, I'm going to go, okay, well, maybe they know something and maybe I'll be all right. And now that's not a full indicator, but it's a starting point. If I am looking at the promotions that you put out in terms of flyers, come and try days, you know, the content on your social media, and the language is very gendered. And when I say gendered, and how the industry says gendered, they talk about it as sex, so male, female. And so it'll say men's teams, women's teams, father, daughter, this kind of language. If that's always in there, that's another indicator to me that you don't necessarily have that knowledge to understand the communities more broadly. So having a look at the content that you're actually putting out in terms of the language and images that you utilize is, again, a really simple but important step to show people that you're trying and learning to include them and to make them feel safe and welcome. They're really simple. A lot of the stuff that you'll go through with the This Girl Can work that you're doing around women and girls, or cis women and girls in particular, will be around sort of the images that are within your facilities. So a lot of the time when we go into sporting clubs, they'll say, hey, yeah, we're inclusive and women and girls are welcome, and then you'll walk into the rooms and there'll just be pictures of the men's teams everywhere. So there's little things like that that you might not even recognize because you're not the one who's being discriminated against. And I think that's a really interesting point for people who've never experienced discrimination, to understand what it's like to be discriminated against, and to recognize why things that might seem to you as unnecessary, or quite minimal and a small thing, it can actually be quite impactful on someone who has experienced discrimination. So taking those things into consideration when you're trying to engage any new community from any diverse or marginalised background is really important. We find within a lot of the research that we do that there tends to be a champion within a club, which is great, really good to have champions, but where we find it's most successful is when it's supported across all levels of the organisation. And that goes from community clubs all the way through to NSOs and corporate organisations as well. If there is support at a leadership level, then it's more likely to be impactful at the ground level as well. So making sure that your committee and your members are working with you on this and that you're driving that change across all levels is really important, but at the same time starting somewhere is great. So again, something else just to consider in the work that you're doing. We also know when working with clubs that some of the responses that we get from clubs when we're working with them is around fear of losing older members that may have less than accepting views of the communities, and usually our response to that when we're working with clubs is, what kind of club do you want and what kind of culture do you want to be creating within your club? We don't want to lose members, but at the same time, by having members with people are entitled to their opinions, but when those opinions are voiced and are discriminated of the space. And again, that's across all organizations, and the research shows that if you have that toxicity within an organization, it spreads very easily, and it makes it harder for people to speak up and to challenge that. And it also takes a very confident person to stand up and to challenge that as well. So there's a few key elements sort of throughout that. We find as well with clubs that, and again, not all clubs, but being able to do a self-assessment of your club and recognizing how the culture is not always a true reflection, because if you, like I said, if you've never experienced that discrimination, you might not realize that it's there. If you've only ever, if you are a woman, if you have a disability, you might notice particular things, but you might not notice those of other communities that that suffer from discrimination and fear. So being able to take a step back and have a bit of a varied take on how your club presents is helpful. As organisations, there are organisations who can help you with that. If you don't know people who are in your club who are open, then I would say speak to organisations and people that you know to support you with that. And again, across all areas, there's a number of resources out there to support with that work, and be open-minded to the fact that
Christine's frozen on my screen, but hopefully she'll come back in just a moment. Oh, Christine, if you're there, you've frozen. I'll give her just another moment for her internet to come back. Oh, hopefully she hasn't jumped out. One moment, folks. We'll just try to get Chrstine back up and running. It looks like she might have dropped out, so we'll try to get her to rejoin. In the meantime, I just want to echo some of the things that she was saying, and I'm sure she was going to allude to the fact that Proud to Play have just released a resource hub. So if you're wanting to do a bit of a review on your club and how inclusive it might be, they've got a bit of a checklist. And you can also chat to someone like me, but this is our job to help clubs be more inclusive. So if you're within the Darebin area, get in touch with me or Proud to Play directly, and they'll be able to help you kind of walk through the checklist and training of how to start making an effort towards honestly reviewing how inclusive are we. And it doesn't have to be within the LGBT space. There's so many other marginalised groups that try to access sport, and the intersectionality between what that might look like for someone who walks in a club that might be perhaps a trans person who's a migrant and has a physical disability. So do you have the structures in place to say, hey, welcome, come and play with us. What would you like to do and how can we make that happen? So thanks, Megan. Proud to Play is the website where you can access that. So what we might do, because Christine's taking a moment, maybe we'll wiggle on through and invite Riley to speak, and then we can do our Q&A at the end and welcome hopefully back Chrstine in a moment. So I'd like to introduce Riley first. So Riley Edwards, who uses they, them pronouns, is a champion for LGBTQ+ inclusion, bringing their extensive advocacy, education, community development and event management experience to all aspects of their work. Riley is passionate about LGBTQ+ and trans advocacy and how they intersect with gender equity and cultural inclusion. This means creating spaces that invite everyone along and where individuals feel proud and empowered to be their true selves. I love that. They believe in a utilitarian approach to building community, and this means person-centered and solution-focused ways of working when it comes to confronting and tackling systemic change. Riley is co-founder of Kinfolks, president of the LGBTQ+ rock climbing club, the Climbing QTs, who have a climbing space in Darebin that I just learned is near my house about a month ago, and is the advisor in diversity and inclusion at RMIT. Please join me in welcoming Riley.
Thank you. I've never had anyone read my bio out before.
Very, very fancy.
Yeah, so I'm just going to tell everyone a little bit about Climbing QTs, and I've got some images because I think that it kind of tells a bigger story. So before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Woiwurrung people, so I'm in Preston here, and recognise that the work that Climbing QTs does is also on the lands that are stolen under colonial occupation as well. We have recently run an event in Sydney as well, so we're slowly expanding, but mostly we're based in oops. So, oh, sorry about that. So to tell you a little bit about Climbing QTs, we have founded in early 2018. We're a not-for-profit, volunteer-run entirely, and we're supported by membership sales that are on a sliding scale, volunteer resources and in-kind support. Members don't need to identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community, but they must identify as allies to the community. So that's really been a really important key aspect for us in terms of the growth of the club, to make sure that everyone feels welcome. So it's more about changing the culture around climbing and the outdoors, rather than just creating another division or a separate space. We recognise there is a place for LGBTQ inclusive safe spaces, but as much as possible we include allies in our journey here as well. So in developing and starting Climbing QTs, we originally started as a little bit of a meetup at the gym, and it's quickly grown over the last 3 years into a bit of an advocacy group. And early on, we identified some key issues. There's that statistic that Chrstine pointed out earlier in regards to people not participating in sport because of their gender identity, but some of the other sort of, I guess, more obvious identified barriers to access climbing and the outdoors. Although we're focused on rock climbing passionately, I think a lot of this can be applied to sports in a more general sense as well. So climbing gyms or sporting spaces that are dominated by cis white male people, which is not a bad thing, but if it's not representative of our community, then it might be really difficult for people to see themselves participating in that sport. Participation involving financial costs of the purchase of equipment, climbing in particular is quite expensive and hard for people to access if they do have limitations in terms of finance. competitions that are really binary and not trans and gender diverse inclusive, not enough representation of LGBTQ people in climbing media or in roles and leadership positions or in professional positions either, and then a lack of leadership and role model positions. So not enough opportunities for LGBTQ people in climbing to excel and grow and learn new skills. So in response to these issues, I think that a lot of our work is trying to, I guess, tackle this and try and create a more inclusive and safe space for LGBTQ people to participate in climbing. And having not known any queer climbers when I was climbing 4 or 5 years ago to now knowing an online community of over 800, I know that they're definitely there. We just weren't really connected, I guess, in the same way before that. So what we really do is just focus on these sort of 4 key points, which is inclusion, visibility, access, and education. So really embedding inclusion within existing spaces, so working with climbing gyms or climbing organisations and outdoor businesses to see how that they can create inclusion within what they've already structured and created. Increasing visibility of climbers in the media, so providing opportunities for people to talk in interviews or nominating ambassadors and champions within existing spaces as well. And in terms of access, we're really talking about physical access as well as financial access, but also access for opportunities for people to learn. So you can imagine if someone's going out rock climbing and they're on the side of a cliff and they're being misgendered and dead named, they're not necessarily going to feel comfortable in that environment, let alone climbing on the side of the mountain. So creating safe spaces where younger or new LGBTQ climbers can learn from other people that are aware of these issues and able to see them for who they are. And then the last point there, which is in regards to education. So we run ally training sessions for staff and professionals in the climbing and outdoors community. And then we also create resources as well for members of our community and then also for allies. That's just a nice photo from the climbing gym of someone in a rainbow outfit. So in terms of, I guess, in recognition of Trans Awareness Week, which we're kind of in the middle of, towards the end of, I just did want to touch on trans and gender diverse inclusion. As a non-binary person myself as well, it's something that I'm really passionate and interested about. And I've just got on the screen some tips in regards to how you might want to embed trans and gender diverse inclusion into your club or business or whatever sport or recreational activity that you participate in. I think a lot of people might not be aware of the issue, the additional barriers that trans and gender diverse folk face when it comes to participating in sport, which, you know, includes active wear. So fitness clothing can be quite revealing of specific body shapes and types, and that can be one barrier. And then on top of that, if someone's wearing a binder, that can be quite restrictive for people that are participating in exercise. So having the freedom to not necessarily wear the binder if they know they don't have to, or feeling like it's okay that they're wearing the binder within a space is something that someone might have to consider. If they were to go camping overnight, which they do with our climbing community, you know, they have to consider whether or not they've got safe and sterile places for their hormone replacement therapy. They need to consider whether or not it's a safe space for them to be able to get changed, you know, within the campsite or use the facilities there. If there's additional financial hardship within this community, we know that trans and gender diverse folk are adversely affected with low rates of employment and discrimination in employment as well. And they're already happy to pay additional costs to take steps to affirm their gender. So taking steps to go under top surgery, for example, can be so expensive. So if they're already spending those costs, they might not have the additional finances to participate in sport. So we try and reduce those barriers as well. Systems and processes like the climbing competitions that aren't inclusive, so there's no option to participate. And then of course the aspect that the trans and gender diverse community is disproportionately affected by poor mental health and well-being. So everything that we love about sport and outdoors that we take for granted, or maybe that's come easily to us, might not be as easy to access for some other people as well. So yeah, just take, you can take a screenshot or a photo of these tips that we have online on the screen, or have a chat with us if you wanted to know how to be more inclusive of the trans and gender diverse community in climbing and the outdoors. I guess, being really visible in your support, really loud and proud, and advocating for us when we're not necessarily in the room as well. So not just when you think that there's someone that's trans sitting at the table doing the pronouns sort of like on an everyday basis, or making it sort of normalized within your spaces. And that's the sort of allyship that we try and promote everyone to do. And that's the end of my presentation. So my contact details are there on the screen if you wanted to get in touch. But otherwise, I'm happy to, I guess, we'll see if Chrstine comes back, or if we wanted to answer some more questions.
Thank you, Riley. That was fantastic. I've lost myself. There I am. That was so great. I've known a lot about climbing QTs from online wiggling around, but it's great to hear from yourself around the ethos of why and how the group formed and what you stand for. And I just think it's such a fantastic avenue for people who are within the LGBT community, or just looking for an inclusive space to explore with getting active. And from hearing Chrstine, she is back, so we'll flick over to her in a moment. From hearing Chrstine talk about the statistics of how disadvantaged people from the LGBT community are in terms of accessing sport and feeling safe to participate, it means so much to have spaces like this available for people. So what we might do now is we'll flick back over to Chrstine and let her finish any points she wanted to make, and then we'll move on into a Q&A. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions for our presenters, I know I've been scribbling heaps of notes, please chuck them in the Q&A section, and we will move on to asking them super quickly. So Chrstine, if you're happy to resume.
Yeah,
welcome
definitely.
back.
Sorry, I have no idea. My internet just randomly dropped out, but just on my computer. So, sorry, just catching the end of Riley's presentation there. They've covered a lot of the points that I was going to get to anyway, which doesn't surprise me. I think sort of just finishing off, one of the things that I say to people is, look, it's a complex and ever-changing space. The language is evolving very rapidly, and it can be daunting to some people, but it shouldn't be. Language is always changing. We're always learning. So I think if you're open to educate yourself and to learn from people know when you're being genuine, and I think that's a big part of it. A lot of the responses that we get is that we're scared of offending people. I think the majority of people won't be offended if they can see that you're genuinely making an effort to educate yourself, and to include them, and to make them feel safe. Apologizing and moving on and correcting yourself is a big part of that, and just acknowledging that. But don't be scared to learn. Don't also assume, though, that if you have one person who is open in your club, that they are going to be the spokesperson and the voice for the whole community. The LGBTQI plus communities are not a homogenous group, as we tend to get lumped under. There are differences and different nuances across all of those communities. So taking the time to understand the barriers for me as a gay woman and might be different to that of someone who is gender diverse or who is transgender. There are little different things that we look for, and try to understand what people have experienced and listen and take it for words. It's not a lot of the time, but people get questioned on things. And I'll give a personal example. I once was talking to a worker who was working with a group of young LGBTQI plus people, but who wasn't part of the community themselves. And they felt that it was okay to ask me basically what I was. And I was like, well, I'm a gay woman. And they turned around and went, you're not. I was like, okay. And they went, you're a lesbian. Which I found quite amusing, that somebody felt it was appropriate to tell me how I identify. There's a lot of assumptions made about that you can tell who someone likes and the type of person that they are based on their appearances, and it's not the case, you know. So don't make assumptions that you know that because someone does this and because they look like that makes them a gay woman, or that makes them this. It's offensive for a number of things, but it's also off-putting to a lot of people. Think about how you would feel if people questioned you about who you are. So a lot of it is, Riley's covered off a lot of it in terms of be visible, be supportive, you know, and show your support and be visible in that support. Don't wait for someone in your club to say, hey, look at me. You know, assume that there are people in your community who may want to come and join your club. Assume that there may be someone in your club who, even though they don't identify as part of the community, they may have family who do. And that will impact on them. And they're wanting to stay engaged in your club and in your sport. So, you know, take those things into consideration. Don't wait. A lot of the time, marginalised communities are left to fight to make change for themselves, when realistically, as a society, we should be fighting for everyone to be included. So yeah, there are key points.
Thank you so much, Chrstine. Good to have you back. And we got your chat in part 1 and part 2, so I think it actually flowed quite nicely. I have so many questions to ask the two of you, so maybe I will have the pleasure of kicking things off, and then if folks have more questions, they can kind of put things in the Q&A, which I can already see sort of people have. I guess for me, I used to work in a psychiatric facility, and we began LGBT training, and one of those was to share our pronouns and to ask our young people what their pronouns were. And it felt extremely clunky and really awkward to begin. And I have to admit, I would only ask folks who looked, who I decided looked gender expansive or trans or whatnot, and that was obviously a mistake of mine, and I've improved on that. What advice would you give to people, and I'm happy for either of you to answer it, that are thinking, I want to be more inclusive. You know, maybe they're a cis person, and for those of you playing at home, you know, cis person is someone who their gender matches their assigned status at birth. So for me, my pronouns are she, her. How would you encourage people to get comfortable with adding this on your signature and putting it up, so we're not just doing the tasks, but we're kind of also learning and moving through and feeling a bit more comfortable with
it? Maybe I'll jump in. I guess I've done a few training sessions in the last week, and this topic has come up just because we're in the middle of Trans Awareness Week as well, and people are asking that, saying, you know, it's quite challenging, or they're worried that they're going to make mistakes, or they're going to misname someone or use the wrong pronouns. And I think it's, you know, first thing is definitely recognize it is a huge change. It is difficult. It's not something that's easily going to happen and switch, but also recognize that, you know, you've been taught to see the world in this very cis and heteronormative way for so long. Don't punish yourself because of that, but you really have to put in the work to start unlearning what you see as the norm, or what the assumptions pop into your mind in the first place when you meet someone new or see someone new. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a magical answer for this question, but we recognize that it's an ongoing learning process. I'm always learning something new in all the training sessions that I run. Just trying to be more open-minded, and even just stopping and pausing when you meet someone new, or you know, I've done the same thing where someone says that, introduces themselves to me with their they them pronouns, and I'm non-binary, and I look at this person, I'm like, oh, you're not who I expected you to look. I'm like, wait, why do I think that? It's because I just have these ingrained ideas about what non-binary people should look like, which is just and now I think I'm hopefully I'm doing a much better job of being like, I don't really care, you can look and behave however you want, your identity is what's important to you. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's definitely answered my question. And I think you've touched on a great topic that's emerged from both of your talks, that fear really prevents action. And we've all been in that position where we're terrified of saying the wrong thing. We want to support the right cause. We feel it in our guts, but there's something that stops us. And I think it's that moment of stuffing it up and getting it wrong, whereas you're identifying your own internalized bias towards this stuff. So I think it's great that we can all say, hey, we're all learning together, and to kind of stumble our way sort of slowly through. Well, let's move on to one of our questions. This is from Jess. I want to visibly, actively be more inclusive in my walking group. Is there any particular language I should use or avoid using in welcoming the LGBTQI+ community?
Yeah, Jess, there's a really great guide by the Victorian government around inclusive language that I don't know if you've got access to that, Lauren, or if you've seen it, but we can certainly send you a link so you can share it with people. It's quite a comprehensive guide. I don't know what Riley's thoughts are on it, but it gives you a lot around the difference between sexuality, gender, the different types of pronouns, and all those kind of things in there. I don't know, my thoughts on it are, if you don't need to use gendered language, why would you use it, personally? So go through your stuff and just go, okay, well, what is in here and what does it say? Particularly within walking groups, unless you're set up for a very specific reason and a very specific targeted group, I would say I don't know about your group, Jess, but walking is not binary in terms of competition, because it's walking. So I think there's probably a lot you can do as a walking group to make sure that your language is quite gender neutral and inclusive of the broader communities. If you've got anything to add to that, Riley?
Not too much. I feel like you've addressed it, but there might be other elements as well, and as to why some people might not feel welcome, or not to imply that they don't feel welcome, but other things that you can do to be visibly, actively inclusive. So in addition to language, we always try and let people know that there's so many different pieces of the puzzle. So who are the images, like the photos that you use to represent your walking group? Like, what's the promotional material look like? Who are the leaders? Who are the people that are speaking to represent the group? And there might be, it might be something as simple as a little rainbow flag. If I'm walking down the street and I see a cafe and one's got a rainbow flag and the other one doesn't, I'm like, I think I'm gonna go to that one with the little flag, because it's just that tiny little invitation. And it really shows that, I talk to the climbing gyms and I say, your doors might be open and everyone can sort of come and go as you please, but are you actually inviting people along and inviting them to come and saying, we want you to be here, and this climbing gym was created with you in mind. So try and have a think about what your walking club as a club might be able to do to put the rest of the piece of the puzzle together.
Yeah, I think sorry, Lauren.
No,
add into that, Riley. I think with walking groups, you generally have listed walks that you're going to be delivering, and you'll have a walk leader or organizer that's attached to that. So like Riley said, just a little bit of a blurb about who they are, and if they're comfortable putting their pronouns on, because again, it shows that you've got a level of understanding that adds to the visual images of flags and such things.
Yeah, thank you both. I love those points. We're actually in the process of creating a list of suggested active recreation and sporting things that people can do if they're from the LGBTQ+ community, and that will be live on our website. So for example, if that walking group was in Darebin and you wanted to specifically welcome the LGBT community, for sometimes when we have events, we might specifically say we welcome gender expansive, trans folk, we welcome people from the LGBT community. And if you were walking this week, you might encourage all of your members, regardless of if they're allies or not, to wear pink and light blue and white, and to celebrate Trans Awareness Week, regardless of their affiliation with the queer community. So we've got another question. This girl can, while being a great campaign that talks about how you look doesn't matter, but I've still felt there was little inclusion for those who are non-binary or more masculine. This is such a great question. Does anyone know of any promotional material available to support this?
I don't know if I can think of any promotional material, but I guess the topic of creating trans and gender diverse inclusive women's spaces has come up with us a few times, and we also recognise that it's really important to create spaces for women because they're also an underrepresented group in sport, but there's other people, like other identities, that might want to and benefit from being included in those spaces. And so I think there's been things in social media and online going around about not tacking non-binary straight on to women because non-binary people don't necessarily identify with that group, or we don't want to conflate those two sort of identities together. There's definitely other ways of being inclusive, trans and gender diverse inclusive, and that might be using alternative spellings of the term women within the promotional material or the use of the word, but also understanding where that spelling comes from and not sort of using it too flippantly, I guess. I've seen the spelling of women with the X used to represent a group of cis straight women, and I was like, oh, that's a bit strange. It feels like appropriation of our culture and our history and all the advocacy work that we've done. So doing a bit of research to understand how that word, what that means, and then also making sure that your group does reflect that. In terms of inviting non-binary and trans and gender diverse women along, I think that as long as you do all those other things to signal inclusion and keep welcoming and keep inviting them along, regardless of how many people show up, I think that they will eventually show up. I know that with our programs, that's the only message that we sort of can put out there and then hope that people come along. But yeah, communication and language is super important and really, really key aspect to this as well. Even if, the This Girl Can campaign doesn't change its name, which we're not saying that it should, it can still be This Girl Can, but they can, there's other ways that brands or campaigns like this can create inclusion. It might just be like a few sentences in the description of the event, or maybe in the subtext or on the poster, or like the types of people that they use in their promotional materials. Yeah. Chrstine, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't know of any, I saw something pop up about resources. I don't know of any specific resources that have been developed to go into that level of detail around the history of language and those kind of things. Unless you've got anything, Riley, I'm not aware of anything. Possibly something we can look at developing based on that conversation. Have you got anything, Riley?
I know that we're developing our own resources, so maybe that'll be eventually available, but
awesome.
You're more than welcome to come and have a chat with us as well, because we're a very, I guess, grassroots club, and we're doing it on our own and navigating these issues at the same time. So more than happy to share our experiences and what we've learned along the way.
Well, from that question, we might touch base with you about that. It's something we can get out there to the broader clubs. There is a big gap in terms of resources for sort of, I guess, sport and recreation industry around inclusion of LGBTQI plus communities, particularly specifics around trans and gender diverse communities. It's very limited. We just recently released some resources and education pieces that are free and online, but even I acknowledge that they're limited in their scope, and they are a starting point. We are in the process of developing additional training that goes into the specifics of different things as well. So even the individual letters within the acronym and giving some of the history around them, we are looking at adding more information into specific modules around the history of LGBTQI plus communities and how that's led to where we are today as well, because sometimes that understanding is really helpful to address your, I guess, knowledge and ability to move forwards in some cases. But I'd say make a start and learn as much as you can, really.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure, there are organisations like ours, and if we don't know the answer, there's other groups. We talk regularly with people like Riley and other groups, and just sort of bounce things off each other, because I think if we all acknowledge that we all have biases and we don't know everything, we can move a lot further forwards. So being able to ask others who might have the answer is great.
Yeah, thank you both. And I want to acknowledge the question and the irony in some ways of running an LGBTI inclusive program under the banner of This Girl Can, and how exclusionary that can be. So I did have some concerns moving forward with that, and I thought, you know what, it's better than not doing it. And through this project, we've had conversations with Vic Health to say, hey, there's actually some really exclusionary things within your campaign that I'd love to talk to you about and link you in with Climbing QTs and, Proud to Play. So hopefully we'll have more information. If anyone wants specific, I guess, language assistance, please email me or any of the panelists from today, and we'll definitely be able to review what you've written or give you some advice. Or I think it's a great starting place to have that listed on events to say we welcome everyone from the LGBT community as a bare minimum, I would think. All right, we've probably got time for one more question and then we'll do the raffle. If you're involved in a club or an organisation whose leadership has a range of commitments towards inclusivity, what are the most effective and easiest steps first? What's the low-hanging fruit? What can we do today?
I mean, I think there's a lot of easy things to do, like putting up that flag and changing language. But I also want to, it's really important to tidy up sort of like your internal systems and what happens in the back end before doing that. I think it's a really nice way of being visible about being inclusive. But if you do end up inviting people into your club or your business or organisation and then they get misgendered or they're excluded from the system because there's no third option for their gender identity in the forms, then they're immediately going to leave again. So I think for us, the first tip we provide is just cleaning up your backyard before raising the flag. So looking at your internal systems and processes and best practice, which can take a little time, but it's better off doing it slowly and properly than sort of rushing into it, trying to get into some sort of deadline. So that's one of the main tips that I usually provide.
Yeah, fully second that. From a This Girl Can point of view, This Girl Can is a sub-license from Sport England, and Sport England did research around participation of cis women and girls across England, and a lot of the research that came back from that is that for cis women and girls, from the point of starting to think about doing a sport or an activity to actually doing it was about 3 to 4 months. If they then went in and that first experience was a negative experience, you'd lost them again for up to another 12 months, if not longer. So that's for cis women and girls. If you're then adding communities that have had historically a very negative and discriminatory experience of sport and recreation on top of other aspects, you could hazard a guess and hypothesize that could be even longer for those communities. So it's really important that you do sort of look to tidy up that back of house first, and that's definitely something that we advocate for as well.
Thanks, Chrstine. I know that Bush Rangers Basketball are a phenomenal organisation that are expanding to deliver roller skating and other really cool kind of sporting recreational opportunities. And through speaking to one of their representatives recently, I asked them, what do you do when it says gender? Like, do you just leave it blank and they fill it out? How do we record stats in that case? And they said, we don't need gender. We need the person's name. And we'd like to know their pronouns if they want to share them. And my head sort of exploded for a moment. And then I just stopped and said, of course, it doesn't really matter. I don't need to know. No one needs to tick that box. Often with events, I want to know how many people turned up and then how many people came back. I think retention in sport is such an overlooked issue, and that's something you just alluded to, Chrstine. So hopefully with the birth of social sport being super important in a post-COVID world or a COVID normal world, we'll be able to see more social competition where that binary of choosing the boys or the girls team or choosing the men's or the women's team isn't a barrier for people who might not fit into those categories anymore. I know that in your talk, Riley, you alluded to the open categories and allowing people to just climb and to just have fun, but even within a participation sort of setting. So I guess we might kind of wrap things up there, but I feel like I could probably keep talking about this for about 5 hours. I want to sincerely thank Chrstine and Riley for coming today and tackling quite an expansive topic. And I want to really thank our participants today who came along and listened. I'm just going to do a quick poll. We'd love to know where you're from. We're not asking your gender. So that we can know if today was a success and if we should do future, I guess, webinar events like this to talk about similar topics. So I'll give everyone a moment to sort of fill out the questions there, and then we'll announce sort of the Fitbit winner. And this webinar will be available on our website if you want to watch it again with closed captions, if that is helpful for you. Great, we'll just give everyone another moment. Lovely. All right, thanks everybody. So our winner of the Fitbit today is Mercedes. So congratulations, Mercedes. If you can flick through your email to us in the chat, we'll get in touch and send that to you in the post. So once again, a big thank you for everyone today. There are some resources listed in the chat. So what I'll do is compile those lists, and people were asking for resources today, and I'll send them in an email to the participants who've registered. And then you'll be able to get in touch with myself if you want any sort of further follow-up. So thanks everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. And there are other This Girl Can webinars happening this week and next week. And we hope that you can join in and enjoy them. So once again, thanks to Vic Health for helping make this happen. And I hope everyone has a great week.